By 1913, America had become the richest country in the world, ripe for the pickings by the world's bankers. America received its very own Rothschild-owned central bank in 1913. The scam is a simple one. Create money out of thin air and lend it to the government for the purpose of war. Finance both sides of the war in order to maximize profits. No need to raise taxes. Inflation will cover the cost. The dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power since 1913. Milton Friedman and Ludwig von Mises have pointed out that inflation is a tax without legislation. With the killing of the Iranian general Soleimani, the war drums are sounding for yet another potential endless war. John Peters spoke to the Oakland Macomb Campaign for Liberty, and our camera was there to record it. But before we play that video, we wanted to get a couple of other perspectives on the death of this terrorist. First, we have Laura Logan, who was on the Sean Hannity show.
Well, I mean, he was a terrorist, and that's not, a subjective saying. That's under U.S. law, he was designated as a foreign terrorist, and that was because Iran has been using terrorism as a tool of statecraft. They have made it part of their foreign policy, and he was the architect of that. And I guess what disturbs me most about the coverage is that there are millions of people in Iran who did not mourn Qasem Soleimani's death. So where was their side of the story? Where were their voices? In fact, I was talking to some of the Iranian opposition leaders just yesterday, and one of them said to me, this funeral and this show of, outpouring of grief was a theater for the Western media, and they bought the whole thing. Where were the pictures, such as the ones I was sent, of people burning Qasem Soleimani's picture in cities across Iran, of people putting pictures of the Iranian opposition leaders? Where were those pictures? And Sean, it was 1,500 people who were killed just a few months ago. And there were Quds Force snipers that were on the streets of Iran, according to the opposition and according to news reports, and to pictures that came out at the time. And those snipers shot young Iranians in the chest and in the head. So those people, their families, are not mourning Qasem Soleimani. And what about those funerals? How much coverage did you see of their funerals? It's quite extraordinary to me that he can be called an inspirational leader. Would you have called bin Laden an inspirational leader? I mean, that would be my question.
Next, we have Erica, a young Iranian-born woman. Erica's video has gotten over 3 million views on YouTube.
Hi, friends. So a lot of you have been reaching out to me, asking me my opinion about what's going on and, wanting to know my opinion. So here's my 2 cents. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sagar, also known as Erica for my American friends who can't say Sagar. I am Iranian American. I have spent the last 12 years of my life as a human rights activist working on Iran policy, watching the Middle East. Yeah, it's a super complex issue, and many of you probably before today had never ever heard of the name Mohandes or Soleimani, but I feel like we're living in the twilight zone, guys. I'm completely outraged at this notion that the propaganda machine that is the media is glorifying Qasem Soleimani. Do you people know that this man has not only the blood of Americans on his hands, but the blood of Iranians, Iraqis, Yemenis, Afghanis? I mean, since when did we start mourning the death of a terrorist? I mean, seriously. I've had friends on the left, both Iranian and American, attack me for echoing the rhetoric of my people. The people in Iran are happy. The people in Iran are happy that this man who was responsible for the slaughter of so many people is gone. Where was your outrage last month when the regime slaughtered 1,600 kids for peaceful protests? Where's your outrage for the thousands of political prisoners that are in Iran right now? Where was your outrage when the Hashtashabi took over the American embassy and like vandalized it and killed an American contractor. Like, I don't understand. So I'm sorry if I'm ranting, but who cares? My opinion doesn't really matter. But for the, in the interest of those that have reached out, here's the deal. I'm an Iran watcher. I'm an Iraq watcher. I'm a Syria watcher. I'm an Afghanistan watcher. And for the people on the ground, they don't hate America. They don't hate Donald Trump. In fact, there's a lot of trending hashtags right now from Iran on Twitter. Thank you, Trump. We thank you. Thank you for, Soleimani. Thank you. Go look for yourselves. And, honestly, guys, if you don't know anything about the Middle East, please keep your opinions to yourself. I beg you, because all you're doing is you're distorting the flow of information. You're drowning out the sound that's coming out from the ground. And people in Iran are happy. And they are giving out, in the Middle East, it's cultural practice to, when something wonderful happens, when there's a marriage or when there's a celebration, you give out cookies, you make cakes. And you should see the videos that are coming out. People are baking cakes. People are giving out cookies in public, in the streets, because they're happy. I don't know. Do we live in a closed society that we don't know that most people in the Middle East are not free? Specifically in Iran, it's an Islamic state. There's no freedom of religion. There's no freedom of speech. There's no freedom of peaceful, protest. And for anyone who disagrees with the regime, they're arrested, they're jailed, they're tortured. And yeah, there's a lot of video coming out right now about, the funeral of Qasem Soleimani. It's so much propaganda, you guys. The regime has been saying death to America for 40 years. They forced us in school to say death to America. I was 7 years old. I didn't know what I was saying. And the people that are like saying that right now, they're called the Basiji. They're like, they're getting paid. They're the ones that get paid to kill people on the street. So yeah, they're going to say death to America, but that's not the people. The majority of the people in the Middle East don't hate America. They don't hate Donald Trump. And I'm probably going to lose a lot of friends for saying this, but thank you, Mr. Trump, for making a very hard decision and for having the moral courage to do something that probably a lot of world leaders wouldn't have had. Anyway, that's my 2 cents. I love you guys. If you want to have a conversation, let's engage. Let's not attack. It's not healthy. And hashtag everybody calm down. There's no World War III coming, okay? God is in control, not man.
So now we're going to shift to a totally different topic. And it's been a lot in the news here lately. What's happening overseas, particularly in the Middle East. And we have our speaker, John Peters, who's spoken to us before. He's extremely knowledgeable on that region and on the dynamics there, as well as the political dynamics here. And John graciously agreed to come and talk to us about this, just what's happening, why is it happening, and what are the ramifications of what's happening in Iraq and Iran and Syria and these other countries overseas. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for John Peters.
I want to approach it is I'd like to talk for about 10 minutes on some points I'd like to raise, and then I'd like to take about 10 minutes of what you may have a question on, because sometimes I can talk right over what you really wanted to know, and that's more important. So I looked at my calendar today and I said, look what's just happened in the last week, right? So on January the 3rd, we conducted a drone strike that killed a major general in the Iranian armed forces in Iraq, and the second in command of an affiliated Iraqi militia. On the 4th, the next day, 5 million people turned out on the streets of Iran to mourn and protest the drone strike. The next day, on the 5th, the Iraqi parliament passed a resolution to expel all foreign forces from the country, which obviously would include U.S. forces. And then on the 7th, which was last night, we were put on notice of an Iranian missile strike on 2 of our bases in Iraq. I thought it was interesting that our president's comment today, I noted I quote 2 of his quotes. One was, "So far, so good." You got to have a pretty low bar to say "so far, so good," I guess. And the other one was, "All is well." I beg to differ with our president. I think we're about as far from "so far, so good" and "all is well" as you can be. But I think the big picture point I want to make, to tie it into the foreign element and our element as Americans, is we are where we are in this destination in foreign policy because we've ignored the wisdom of George Washington in his farewell address of September 19, 1796, in which he implored us not to get bogged down in foreign entanglements, to avoid foreign alliances and other people's battles. And now we're so wound up in it, in that region, that we don't know which way to turn, because parties that were at one time presumed to be allies are now opponents. Sometimes we're forced to choose between 2 allies and thereby making one of them an enemy. And that's exactly what Washington was trying to admonish us about. He said, there's no reason for you to get involved in these, because no sooner than you take the side of one party in their battle, you'll make 3 new enemies that you didn't have and you didn't need to have. All right? So we look at this ball of yarn that we're caught up in the Middle East, and it's a great demonstration of how far we've gone down that road. Of course, all the talking points this week have been about a gentleman by the name of Qasem Soleimani. He's the Iranian general that we took out. Terrorist or hero? Well, I remember one time a guy had a great take on this line when you say, is the glass half empty or half full? And his answer was, it depends if you're drinking or you're pouring. So I think the same thing applies to terrorist or hero, right? It depends on which side of him you're on, right? We've been told he's a terrible person. Why is he a terrible person? I had a conversation with a vet 2 days ago about this. He said, John, he was aiding Iraqi militias that were killing our soldiers in Iraq. I said, okay. I said, let me turn it around. I said, if Iran had the ability tomorrow to invade and occupy Canada by force, would you support the Canadians who are resisting the Iranian occupation with arms and other forms of support? Well, of course I would. That's my point. It really depends on which side of this thing you're on. When we flip it back and try to apply the same policy or rule to if it was happening here, of course, it gets totally flipped around. And I think that's what happens. We lose sight of the fact that what's sovereignty? Sovereignty means, in theory, we're all equal as nations. We have to respect each other's borders. We have to respect each other's politics. We can't be overturning governments, telling people who they can have for a government. But we've gone so far down this road that we just take it as a given that we have the right to do that, and we are right in doing it. So a little bit about Qasem Soleimani. He's an interesting guy. He was born in 1957 in Iran, and so he lived about 22 years. He was about 22 years old when the Iranian Revolution took place in 1979, and they installed the Ayatollah. It wasn't long that they had to digest the revolution before Iraq invaded Iran, and the Iraq-Iran war was underway, an 8-year war that killed, I think the estimates are about 1 million soldiers on both sides. And why is that important? Well, it's important because people come of age in those years, and they shape people's view of life and things that they have to do in life. So for Soleimani, he was a young soldier. He was, I think I did the math, he was from 23 to 31, he participated in this war defending Iran against Iraq. What were we doing? We're back to our example of not knowing what to do. We were aiding both sides in the war. Iran-Contra, you may remember, we're not dealing with Iran, but we did when it suited our purposes, all right? So we sold weapons to Iran on the down low. We sold them openly to Iraq, including the dreaded chemical weapons that we now accuse all these third world countries of using as an excuse to invade them militarily. We sold the chemical weapons to Saddam. We knew he was going to use them. He did use them against Iran. It was a very brutal, bloody war that in the end ended in an absolute deadlock. Nobody conquered any territory. Nobody moved the line. There was just a lot of death and destruction. But what Soleimani learned during that battle was it was his first exposure to how America was approaching Iran and how he had to evaluate America's intentions. So what does he know? He knows they're aiding the enemy of Iran. He's trying to defend his country, and he's got to fight Iraq, and Iraq's being aided by the United States. Then from about 1985 to 2000, he is sent to southern Lebanon to help advise these Lebanese militias, including Hezbollah, how to defend against the Israeli invasions in southern Lebanon. He comes back to Iraq, and it's important to mention, because this is one of the charges laid on him as part of the death sentence, is that he is responsible for the death of the 83 U.S. Marines in the barracks in Beirut that was blown up by a car bomb.
He was over 200. I think he was over 200.
Killed?
241.
241, thank you. And then there was about a smaller number of French soldiers that were killed either the same day or the next day in a similar attack. So again, you look at it and you say, well, it's a horrible thing. It is a horrible thing. But again, our soldiers were killed, the French soldiers weren't killed on American soil or on French soil. They were killed in somebody else's country where they were there as a military force. That's always the risk we take when we send troops to these other countries. You're exposing these troops. I mean, if they're welcome, they're not going to be attacked, presumably. If they're welcome, they're welcome. If they're being attacked, it's because somebody sees them as a force of occupation or aggression. You don't attack your friends, right? So that was one of the warrants, let's say, put on Soleimani that carried through the years. They never really produced the evidence to show his level of involvement or whether he's involved at all, but he carried that. And he knew he carried that. I don't think he was surprised that one day somebody was going to kill him. He made a lot of enemies doing what he did. As any soldier or any accomplished warrior does, and I think even military men in the West will tell you that although it was always their intention to get him, their intention to get him was because he was so effective in combating what it was our forces did and other forces did. So a lot of people said, boy, I'll bet he never knew that was coming. I think he knew it was coming any day, any time, his whole life, because that's the path that he chose, as warriors do. From 2000 on, he became an advisor to militias that were in Iraq, that were fighting both against groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but also against the American occupation. That's another warrant that's put on Soleimani. He later became an advisor when the Syrian war started in 2010. He became an advisor to the Syrian armed forces and worked with both the Russians and the Syrians in the fight against ISIS and Al-Qaeda, these groups in Syria. That's another whole story that we just don't have time to get into. But it's interesting how he's seen, because it depends on the snapshot in time that you take it. Our forces were more than willing to work with Soleimani and worked with him openly in Iraq when they wanted to fight against certain specific groups that he was aligned against as well. And at the minute that task was done, as far as we were concerned, he was back on the bad guy list. So we flipped back and forth and back and forth. People in the region, I'm not talking about in the West, but in the region from Iraq to Syria to Lebanon, all largely credit him as being the moving force behind the defeat of ISIS and al-Qaeda in these areas, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. I can tell you firsthand that the Christian communities in particular in Iraq and in Syria, they revere him. They had masses for him this week in these Christian areas. He literally saved these Christian areas from extinction by these groups that unfortunately we decided to put our stock in and to get behind to fight. You know, something really interesting I think happened this week, and I don't know how many people's attention it caught. When Iraq passed this resolution saying the American forces had to go, our president said a couple of things. One is he said, well, we're not going until you pay us for that air base. And I kind of chuckled because I said, you know, for Trump, everything's a real estate deal, right? So you got to pay for the air base. Well, I don't think they asked for you to build them an air base. As I recall, we invaded the country under a pretext that proved to be false, and we established an air base that we wanted to use as a forward operating base, in part to check Iran. But the other thing that he said is we are immediately suspending the fight against ISIS. I thought that was extremely interesting. Why would we do that? Why would we do that? Didn't the president tell us that ISIS is our biggest enemy and Americans are threatened by ISIS and we're at war with ISIS? Why would you suspend a battle against somebody that is supposed to be your worst enemy and that you're there to fight? Unless you're not really there to fight them and they're not really your enemy, but they're a proxy force that you use as you see fit to use them. I believe personally one of the reasons that they suspended the fight against ISIS, or they've threatened to do it, is a way of gaining entry back into Iraq if they are expelled. They'll step out, they'll let ISIS regenerate, cause all kinds of havoc in Iraq, and hope that the Iraqis will beg us to come back and take care of the problem, then we're back again. So it's a real cynical game that goes on. There's an interesting thing in the news today. There was a caller into an Iranian talk show in Iran, and he's speculating. He said, if we wanted to retaliate and kill somebody of equal stature of General Soleimani, who would that be in the United States? And I thought for a minute, I'm like, who would that be? Is there anybody that if we lost them, that we'd turn out 5 million people in this? I don't think there's anybody in the country that we would do that for. El Sharpton. You mean in a celebration versus mourning, huh? But all this brings us right back to where we went wrong. Again, had we followed Washington's advice, had we not gone down this road, we wouldn't be dealing with what we're dealing with now. And now we have all these quandaries. Do we go to war with Iran? Do we fight to stay in Iraq against the wishes of the people in Iraq? Do we choose sides within Iraq if there's a division and some want us to stay and some want us to go? Do we leave Syria? You know, it's interesting, again, how far we've gone down this road, because when President Trump said he was pulling American troops out of that area of Syria where the Kurds were, and he took a lot of flack for it, all he really did was shuffle them over to the oil fields in the eastern part of Syria. And then he openly made it known, I give him credit for being transparent, that we're taking over the oil fields, we're taking the oil, and if anybody tries to interfere with that, we'll deal with them militarily, including the Syrians, whose oil it is. So this is how far we've moved down this road. But forget about the wishes of all the people in these areas we've invaded and occupied. What about the wishes of Americans? Does it even matter anymore whether we want to be involved in these wars? I don't know anybody that signed on for these wars, whether they be in Syria, whether they're in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, which has been going on longer than my third son was, before he was born. We're in more wars now than we've ever been simultaneously. All right, not we're in a war, we conclude the war, but we're in another one. These are all going on simultaneously. We don't know if the Turks are our friends or our enemies. We don't know if we should deal with the Russians or we should fight the Russians. We don't know if we should support one group in Iraq or another group. We don't know if we're going to be on, we should use ISIS and Al-Qaeda to try to overthrow the government in Syria, or we should go to war with ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Our policy is so confused that I don't even know if you can call it a policy. But as Americans, I think we have to regain control, civilian control of the military, and we have to gain control of the Congress, and we have to insist that Congress step up and do their constitutional duty where wars are concerned, because where we stand now is we've got an executive who is like a king. And I don't mean just Trump. I mean, this has been going on for many administrations in both parties, where the president simply takes it on himself to commit the nation to these military deployments and these wars that they can't get us out of. They have no stated goal. There's no end to them. And they have tremendous cost to us. So I think that's the biggest thing that we need to address. Certainly this situation with Iran right now kind of highlights it, but there's a bigger problem that's been going on now for a long, long time that we as Americans have to address. You know, I talk to people back in that area, especially in Syria, and, you know, thank God for this, because despite what we've done to the country, you know, they say, look, we don't blame the American people. We like Americans. We understand what's going on in America. It's the government. And they do what they want to do. And I thought, how ironic was this? Take this resolution by the Iraqi parliament for us to leave Iraq. Americans want American forces out of Iraq, and Iraqis want American forces out of Iraq. We're on the same page as people, right? So who's in the way? The government that we don't control. And it took a foreign parliament to do something that we couldn't get our own government to do, assuming that they do it. All right, so that's kind of what I wanted to touch on, but if any...
Force the EPA, but not
Right.
the states. The EPA has memorandums of agreement with the states to allow them in the states to do their duty.
Yeah, no, I'm familiar with the 10th Amendment Center, and thank God for them. And thank God for all these movements, because we have to take back control of our government from foreign interests and domestic interests that don't have our best interests at heart, okay? Here's another evolution to think about, how far we've slid down this slope. In theory, we're only supposed to commit forces when there's an imminent threat to the national security of the United States. And then it's supposed to be pursuant to a declaration of war, not an authorization for the use of military force, which is nothing more than an end run around the Constitution. But now we've gone from an imminent threat to the national security of the United States. Listen carefully when your politicians explain why they took these actions. It's affecting our national interests. Our national interest. First of all, what does that phrase mean? You could fit anything into that phrase, right? It's not capable of a definition. So now we've taken an imminent threat to our national security and expanded it to this phrase, wherever our national interests are affected. Well, you could pick out anything and say our national interests were affected, ignore the Constitution, and the president can send forces there and create a new battle. There's plenty of people getting rich. Don't ignore the economic factor in these wars. There are people getting very, very wealthy over these, especially with more privatization of the military. You have a lot of companies that's what they exist off of, is supporting the military, whether it's building barracks or transport companies or food service companies or whatever it is. So it's good business for a lot of people. And that's why these wars are lasting longer. So we've ignored the Constitution. We've expanded the definition of what will trigger a use of military force. We've essentially abandoned it to the executive with no checks. And we're now in wars in more countries than we've ever been in, simultaneously, and for longer terms than we've ever been in. 10, 15 years. I mean, it's unbelievable.